How's it going, everybody? This is Cameron White with White Light Astrology, and today we're going to be talking all about the Mercury retrograde happening in Leo this July of 2019. Thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys. And in this video, we're going to be covering all of the logistical stuff of when Mercury enters its shadow and leaves its shadow, when it stations retrograde, when it stations direct, all of the aspects Mercury is going to be making to the other planets during this time. As well, more towards the end of the video, that's when we're going to be uncovering a little bit more about what this Mercury retrograde is going to bring up, how to really utilize this, and really how to counterbalance it, because, you know, Mercury retrogrades kind of suck sometimes. So first things first, on June 20th, this is when Mercury is going to enter its shadow, meaning Mercury will eventually come back to this degree and station direct and start to move forward again later on in a few weeks. Now, when Mercury enters shadow, this is usually kind of like the pinpoint time to really look at whatever Mercury retrograde brought to you. It kind of started around this date. And what's important about this Mercury entering shadow phase is that it's going to be conjunct the planet Mars. And Mars and Mercury are going to be conjoining each other a few times during this retrograde, which is going to be really important to look at. And while Mercury is entering its shadow at 23 degrees Cancer, Mars is also going to be at 23 degrees Cancer. And Mars is in its sign of fall here, which means Mars isn't really working all too well here. And when you have Mercury, the messenger, communicating Mars's message of, you know, Mars is angry, hot, dry, it's wanting to go forward, it's wanting to confront and initiate. However, it's in a sign where it doesn't really, it kind of struggles with doing that a little bit. Mercury's kind of projecting that message and kind of raising up that voice a little bit more, so pay attention to June 20th when that happens. Now, the next thing that's going on is a couple days later on June 26th, this is when Mercury is going to move forward and go into the sign of Leo, where it will eventually station retrograde. Then as we move forward on July 7th, that's when Mercury actually stations retrograde at 4 degrees of Leo. Now, Mars is also going to be in Leo at this time, and it is going to be applying to a conjunction with Mercury as Mercury starts to move backwards in the sky. Now, Mars is in the sign of Leo, where it's not in its fall like it was in Cancer. It can be a little bit more Martian. It can be a little bit more constructive. Mars has affinity to the tools that it likes to use while it's in the sign of Leo. However, as Mars applies to a conjunction with Mercury rather than Mercury applying to a conjunction with Mars, this is going to be a big time to really look at what is Mars kind of creating with this Mercury stuff. And if you know about Mars in astrology, Mars is all about our anger, our frustrations. It's our energy and it's our drive. It's how we act. It's how we initiate. It's how we defend ourselves. It's how we attack things. And while Mars is in the sign of Leo, which we'll be discussing more about this later on, Mars is in this solar sign of Leo of wanting to, you know, defend itself, act on its proudness, act on its ego, and that can be a little bit frustrating to deal with sometimes. However, also on July 7th, while Mercury stations retrograde, it is going to be squaring Uranus almost exactly. And while Uranus is the planet of breakthroughs and breakdowns, unexpected events happening, with Mercury stationing retrograde right at that square, this may cause a lot of unexpected things to come up. Then the next day on July 8th is when Mercury actually makes the exact conjunction to Mars, which is going to be bringing up more of the irritating part of things, the more severing, the more cutting, the more direct communication type stuff that Mercury retrogrades normally wouldn't really have. However, this one's a little bit different. Then as we move forward a few days later, that's when on July 18th, that's when Mercury's going to retrogress back into Cancer, where it will eventually station direct, but it's got to do a couple things first. Then a few days later on July 21st, that's when Mercury's going to be cazimi, and that's going to be happening at 28 degrees Cancer. This is really important in Mercury's cycle with the sun, because as Mercury stations retrograde and starts coming closer and closer towards the Earth, in between the Earth and the sun, when Mercury conjoins the sun, we call that cazimi, and that's basically in the heart of the sun, where Mercury can get purified by fire in a sense, and where Mercury can make more sense of things and things can be better understood. Then a few days later on July 24th, that's when Mercury's actually going to conjoin Venus. At this time, Venus will be at the later degrees of Cancer, and while Mercury's retrograde, Mercury gets to fall right into the arms of Venus. This is a lot more comforting, and this is bringing a lot more of the what needs to be addressed through a open heart and an open mind type thing with this Mercury retrograde. Because as we're going to talk about, this Mercury retrograde is going to be bringing up a lot of stuff. So after Mercury goes cazimi, then it's going to conjoin Venus. This is looking a lot softer and looking a lot nicer as we move forward. Then on August 1st, almost a month later, that's when we're going to have Mercury stationing direct. This is also going to be on the new moon in Leo, so this is going to be some refreshing energy we get after this, and this is going to feel a little bit more, we're going to feel a little bit more confident about addressing what Mercury in retrograde has brought to us. Then as we move forward on August 11th, Mercury will move back into Leo, and it's still in its shadow phase, so this is when we're going to be kind of reworking and re-going over everything that Mercury retrograde brought us. Sometimes it's a hassle, sometimes it's a struggle, but we got to go back over it and do it the right way this time. And then on August 14th, that's when Mercury leaves shadow and eventually starts to move forward again. So all in all, Mercury enters shadow on June 20th, and it doesn't leave shadow till August 14th. So we have almost, 2 months of Mercury kind of playing around and moving around quite a bit. So I do think that these next 2 months are going to be quite intense with this. So let's go ahead and start talking about what all this stuff means. So with this Mercury retrograde, there's a few things I want to keep in mind here. One, it's happening almost strictly during the eclipse cycle, meaning we're going to be having eclipses in the signs of Cancer and the sign of Capricorn. Eclipse season is always a weird time. It's when there should be light and it gets blocked out. It's kind of like, looked at as a malefic energy, as in not good. And that's not to say that this is all going to be a train wreck. However, with eclipses going on, you have the sun and the moon lighting things up essentially. And that light gets cut out in eclipse. So where things should be making sense or putting the pieces together, they're not fitting and it's not kind of connecting in a way. So this Mercury retrograde can kind of enable more of that confusion and more of that misunderstanding, more of that there should be something going on here and it's not, something got rearranged and changed. That's all just to say that this Mercury retrograde's got a lot of different things going on. So not only will it be eclipse season, and as you guys know, this is going to be a rough summer with these eclipses, we also have Mercury conjoining Mars 3 different times. First time is right before it hits shadow, then it's going to hit Mars again once it stations retrograde, and then it'll hit Mars later on as it moves forward once again. Now, this is pretty important because usually Mars doesn't apply to Mercury. Mercury's the faster planet here. Mercury would be the planet applying to another planet. However, because Mercury stations retrograde right when Mars is hitting it again, Mars actually gets to give energy to Mercury and it gets to give something to it basically, which really changes the theme with this. Mars is this planet that's hot and it's dry and it's vulgar, and it's going to be at first in the sign of Cancer where it's not working all that well. But as Mars actually applies to Mercury, it'll be in Leo, where we're going to be talking a lot about Leo energy and what that really means. However, while Mars is in Leo, where we're wanting to act out of our pride and act out of our ego at times when we're not in alignment with, I don't want to say in alignment with who we are, but when we're not aware of ourselves in that manner, it can be really easy to act out in those ways. And so while Mercury is retrograde, where, I don't have to tell you guys that Mercury retrogrades are known for miscommunications, errors in, communicating to someone in any type of way, shape, or form. With Mars applying to Mercury, I think this is bringing a more hot, a more spicy flavor to this that's a little bit more stingy and pungent than usual. And I think that's going to be important to know as we continue on with Mercury's retrograde. And then, of course, the other thing I wanted to talk about was that Mercury's squaring Uranus this whole time. And, the eclipse is already going to make things crazy. The Mars conjunction that's going on is already kind of making this, a pretty intense flavor. I think while this is squaring Uranus too, this is going to be a little bit more unpredictable. While Uranus is in Taurus, and Uranus of course is the planet of extreme breakthroughs, breakdowns, it's wanting you to be liberated, it's wanting you to have freedom, but it's at the cost of things failing and not working all of a sudden. Mercury squaring that, making a harsh aspect, is kind of like, something unexpected happened and that kind of changed the flavor for Mercury a little bit, and now it has to kind of go backwards. And so I think while Mercury squares Uranus, this is a big time to roll with the punches, almost literally. While Mars is applying to Mercury, we got these eclipses going on, Mercury's squaring Uranus. This is a time to roll with the punches and not, it's kind of like expecting the unexpected, but knowing you're going to get punched in the face and knowing how to take it is way better than going, I hope I don't get punched in the face right now, and then all of a sudden, boom, you get punched in the face. Like, that doesn't work. You want to be prepared for this type of stuff. But one thing I really wanted to talk about with this Mercury retrograde is the fact that it's happening at these early degrees of Leo. Now, when we talk about the sign of Leo, we're talking about the sun. We're talking about solar qualities. We're talking about identity. We're talking about, things dealing with ego, things dealing with pride, things dealing with, the sense of loyalty that Leo can bring about. However, what's important about Leo and the sun is that this brings light to things, and that this is bringing a nice dry light that is all encompassing, like it is all seeing. The sun is that energy that we radiate, that we kind of put off to the world. That's why it's so easy to relate to your sun sign, especially if you're a Leo or born in the day. However, with Leo being about these solar qualities of identity, of our sense of self, of how we're viewed and how we're seen because of our light that we exuberate, this is going to be really important because Mercury, of course, is the communicator. It is the messenger. Mercury is our ideas and our thoughts and how we're thinking about things and why we're thinking about things and what values we're putting into those thoughts that are initially going to change our mind about stuff that's eventually going to change our actions and our behaviors. However, Mercury stationing retrograde is not always a bad thing. See, Mercury likes to play games. Mercury likes to mess with our heads. Mercury likes to change things up. That's why it's the fastest moving planet. It's known as the trickster. It goes back and forth and back and forth. It's kind of hard to see Mercury in the, either at sunrise or sunset. It's very small. It's very close to the sun. However, what's important to realize with Mercury retrogrades is that Mercury is now moving backwards. So where it went over something, where it went over a certain path, it missed something. It didn't pick up everything that it needed to. So Mercury is now going to be moving backwards. And in the sign of Leo, I'd want to hit so much on the idea of identity and expression of that with Leo. Now, as we talked about earlier, Mars is also in Leo, and Mars heats things up. It makes things dry. It makes things very attentive, like it brings about a reaction to you. And while Mars is in Leo, where it can be very much easy to, the energy is very enabling of acting out on, our egos or being prideful or, just doing things in a loud and proud manner. And that's totally okay. However, that can kind of bite us in the, butt sometimes. And while Mercury is stationing retrograde in Leo, Mars is coming up and hitting it. And that's pretty important because, of course, Mars severs and cuts. So while it's hitting Mercury, the way that we think, our thoughts, and how we're communicating these things, that's kind of like cutting away from a certain idea or a certain thought or a certain way of expressing. Now, of course, this has to do with the sign of Leo, and this is going to be more of the archetype that we're talking about. And one thing that I couldn't get out of my head when I was writing all of this and kind of, thinking about this was that this seems so much like a detachment away or a reimagining of our sense of self. Kind of realizing where our egos and our, pride can get in our way, and understanding that in order to make the right decisions, in order to be a true leader of self, that has a lot to do with this, with Mars being in Leo and really acting out on, what being integrity looks like, what being in, being authentic, I know those are kind of like broad words, but Mars in Leo is very much like only act on integrity, only act on the things that you believe in, act out of loyalty and trust, and have some authenticity. And while Mercury stations retrograde and Mars is hitting there, that's kind of like, do we need to reimagine ourselves, and do we need to look at our identity and through a different view? And what is more integral with who we are? And how do we need to express that in a greater, more passionate manner? Because while Mercury stations retrograde in Leo, where it wants to roar, doesn't really have not necessarily the audience, but may not have that vocal power, that diaphragm power to really back it up. Now, the other important thing about this Mercury retrograde is that it's going back into Cancer, where again, it's going to go cazimi in the sun in Cancer. That's when it's going to also conjoin Venus. It won't exactly make an opposition to Saturn again. We're kind of over that. But I want to hit on the fact of Cancer and Leo, both ruling the sun and the moon. These are the luminaries. These are the things that light things up. And I brought about not the idea, but the fact that we're going through the eclipse season during this Mercury retrograde, because this Mercury is in the sign of the luminaries, and the luminaries are getting cut out of light. And I wanted to bring that up because as Mercury goes into the sign of Cancer, where it goes into the sign of the moon, which lights up what we don't always see. The moon moves really fast. The moon kind of does whatever it wants in the night sky. It changes, it flows, it gives light to other planets. This is kind of lighting up what we don't always see. And this comes down to the stuff that we internalize, the stuff that isn't out and about and bright like the sun is, and that stuff that can be more hidden and more concealed. Now, the sign of Cancer, of course, is all about emotions and trust and empathy. It has to do with relating. It has to deal with vulnerability and protecting of that. And as Mercury retrogresses back into Cancer, I think this is about kind of like, while Mercury retrograde in Leo, we can kind of see where we kind of didn't come off right, and what we thought, I don't want to say what we thought we were or what we thought was going to be the best, necessarily wasn't. And while Mercury is retrograde in Leo, where we're having this reimagining and this re-identifying with what ourselves are, how we view ourselves, and what's more integral and what's more authentic to us, Mercury has to go back into Cancer, where it, earlier it was conjoining Mars in Cancer. It already had to establish what its needs were, but it kind of did that in an aggressive way. As Mercury goes back into Cancer, this is really reflecting on what are those needs? What makes us who we are? What are our values? Where do we, what do we want to protect? What do we need to nurture? Who are we on this internal level, and where can we water those plants? I like to say that because oftentimes we can neglect what we need to tell ourselves and what we need to confront ourselves on and what we have to say to ourselves. It's easy to talk to other people and tell other people how to live their lives or what they need, but it can also be really hard to reflect on what our own needs are. And as Mercury retrogresses back into Cancer, I think this is kind of a step back before we say something, not that we'll regret or anything, but that may be a little bit incorrect and inauthentic. Let's have a check back in with ourselves and go, is this who I am? Is this how I really feel? Is this what I need to say? Is this what needs to be addressed? And during this time that Mercury comes back into Cancer, Venus is going to be in Cancer, and it's receiving Mercury with open arms. And Venus, of course, is the planet of love and connecting. She wants to bring things together. She wants you to indulge in richness of the things that give us life. And as Venus is in Cancer, where a lot of this love is coming to the self, it's coming onto what needs to be nurtured, what needs to be protected. It's like babying the baby. Like the baby needs to be, coddled and, it needs to be burped and laid down. I don't know how to raise a kid, so I don't know what I'm saying here, but you get the idea of what I'm saying. With Mercury coming back onto Venus, this is kind of like, where do we need to address and have more of that open heart connection, not only with other people, but with ourselves, with what our needs are. Now, as Mercury goes direct and starts to move forward back into Leo, I think this is giving us a way better and way clearer vision of how we identify ourselves and how we express that. What's more integral and what's more authentic. Now, I do bring about this because later on, while Mercury goes back into Leo, this is when Venus is going to go Cazimi with the Sun. This is when everything's basically going to be in Leo, where this has a lot to do with identity. This has a lot to do with and not just, identity in the very blanket sense. This has to do with actually living our lives, actually being our full selves, not just 80% you, but 110% yourself, whatever that looks like. And what I want to hit on too is with Leo and Cancer, things aren't being written down in black and white. This isn't supposed to be, statements that are going to be held and kept forever. This is about understanding through imagery, through relating, through communication, more about, again, how we're expressing our light, how we're being more integral and more authentic with ourselves, and reimagining ourselves to be who we want to be, who we're trying to grow into, but doing that in a way that isn't inauthentic, that isn't coming from the ego, but that's actually coming from what our needs are and our true selves in this kind of weird way. I think the summer is going to be really weird with, we had Mars opposing Saturn, and we have these eclipses going on that are really going to kind of change how things really go down. But I do think that this Mercury retrograde all comes back down to, in order to take care of our needs, we have to reimagine ourselves to be greater than we think that we are, and we have to fulfill that role. We have to trust that process. We have to love ourselves enough to be expressive of our full authentic selves, and I think that's going to take some reworking as we go through this, period over the summer with these eclipses that really bring out a power dynamic that needs to change. So with that being said, I hope this Mercury retrograde gives you guys a lot to think about. You're going to survive. It's going to be fine. There's going to be a ton of other things happening with this Mercury retrograde, but I think it really does come back down to, let's see how we can view ourselves in a different light, and let's give ourselves a more authentic, a more integral look at ourselves. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys.